Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. In continuing our discussion about biblical interpretation and how to properly approach God's Word and how to accurately handle His Word of truth, as Paul instructed Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 15, we've talked about our need to zoom out and really get a big picture look at the Bible before actually zooming in. And in the last video, we looked at the big picture of the Bible as a whole, what was going on as a whole, and so now we kind of want to start zooming in a little bit more into some of the individual books of the Bible. And let me just suggest this. The best way really to get the big picture of a particular book of the Bible is to read it, and to try your best to read it in one sitting. Now I understand with many books of the Bible that's probably not going to be very feasible. Some of the books are 50 chapters long or something like that, and so that's going to be difficult to do that in one sitting. But let me suggest that you do that in as few sittings as possible. So try to read the Bible in large chunks or large sections, because what that's going to do is that's going to allow you to see the big picture of a book in the Bible and the flow of what the book is talking about, how it starts, how it transitions, how it ends. You're only going to really see that if you sit down with it and try your best to read it in one sitting. I mean, can you imagine, let's say Genesis is 50 chapters, and it is. What if you just read one chapter a week for 50 weeks? Would you really have a good idea of what the book is about as a whole after those 50 weeks? Well, I don't know. If you only did one chapter every 1 week for 50 weeks, you'd probably start to forget what you read way back 50 weeks ago. That's a really, really long time. That's almost a year to read Genesis. That's just not going to be very practical in understanding the big picture. And let me also say this, that many of the New Testament writings are letters, and they are meant to be read all at once. For instance, notice Colossians chapter 4. This is a letter that's written to the church that's located in Colossae. Okay, and notice what Paul says in this letter at the very end. He says in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, he says, "When this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans. And you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea." So here you see that Paul is writing letters to these churches, and when this letter of what we call Colossians, when that arrived to the church in Colossae, they were supposed to read that letter. And we need to understand that back in their culture, not everybody was literate. Okay, we're very blessed in this day and age. For the most part, people, especially in America, are literate. We teach that at a very early age. Back then, not everybody was. A lot of people couldn't read. And so what they would do is they would have one person who could read. They would get up in front of the congregation and they would read this letter that Paul wrote to them. And they wouldn't just read, one part of it. No, they would read the whole thing, because that's the only way you can really get the meaning out of it. I understand we have our chapter divisions. There's 4 chapters in Colossians. When they got it, they didn't have any chapter breaks. Chapter breaks were added later on in history. The original letter had no chapter breaks, so it wasn't like they got up and said, well, we're going to read chapters 1 and 2 of Colossians today in our assembly. No, they just said, hey, Paul sent us a letter. We want to know what he says. We want to know his teaching, because he's an inspired apostle. So they read through that whole letter. So when we sit down and we open to the letter of Colossians, we should try our best to just sit there and read through the whole thing, and read through it again, or read through it multiple times if you can. That's really going to be the best way to get the big picture of the flow, what's happening in this letter, who wrote this letter, who was this letter written to, what are the types of problems that this letter is addressing. Those are all questions that we want to know that help fill out the purpose and the big picture of why this letter was written. Because that's always what we want to ask. Why was this written? When the original recipients received it, what did they understand it to mean? What did they understand it to be addressing? because these letters were written specifically for them to address the issues that they had. And Paul, in fact, expected them to take this letter of Colossians and go to the city of Laodicea and have them read it too. And that's really how many of the New Testament letters were so widely circulated, even by the end of the first century. So I hope that that's helpful and clear. And Lord willing, I'll see you next time.